Okay, so this video is dedicated to the fads, and Dean and I are going to act as your personal mythbusters. So let's dive into some of the biggest myths with regards to brain health.
So here we'll talk about 5 of the fads. First, we'll talk about the low carb or keto diet. Then we'll talk about gluten, which can become a fad. Then we'll talk about paleo, and then lectins, which is the newest one. And then finally, we'll talk about the coconut oil fad.
Let's start with the low carb diet. Now, there's been interest in carbohydrate restricted diets for a very long time, particularly in the context of diabetes management, and especially during the times before the advent of insulin therapy. And now in a low carb diet, total means of daily carbohydrate intake is usually below 45% of total calories. When you eat a low carb diet, you're basically taking high levels of fat and or protein as a percentage of total calories. Because when you cut out a massive source of calories from your food, you're bound to add something else. And so fat and protein are very high. So high protein diets are a variation of a low carbohydrate themes. And unlike other prominent dietary categories, low carbohydrate eating is associated with quite limited population level and cultural experiences and data. So there's not much out there. One frequently cited exception is the Inuit diet. Now, the Inuits, who were Eskimos and lived in barren landscapes and environment, their diet was low in carbohydrates. However, the Inuit diet was by no means concordant with popular interpretation of low carbohydrate eating, given its traditional focus on marine animals or fish, including seal and whales. Now, the Inuit diet was exceptionally high in omega-3 fatty acids, which is not characteristic of most low-carb diets that you see around us nowadays. Of note, the Inuits never had exceptional health or longevity, and they were especially subject to intracranial hemorrhage or brain bleeds, perhaps because of the high fat intake in their diet. They actually had shorter lives, and this has been published. And the whole theory of the Inuit diet was debunked many years ago by a study conducted in Finland. Now, low-carb diets can definitely help with weight reduction in short phases, but with all the fat and all the protein, you remove the brain-preserving qualities of fiber that are found in starchy vegetables. You add bad fats that cause inflammation in the brain, and long-term, you put yourself at a higher risk of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and diabetes, which leads to massive brain damage in ways of strokes and Alzheimer's dementia.
So as an extension of the low-carb diet, as we said, if you take one thing away, you have to put something else in its place. So in this case, usually high fats. So whenever you have low carbs and high fats, the body has to resort to a different kind of metabolism. It has to resort to ketogenic or keto-producing metabolism. So what happens is it produces lots of these small carbon molecules, ketones, that can cross through membranes, even through blood-brain barrier. And people said that they feel more energy is because it gets to the cell so easily. It gets to the neuron so easily. But that short-term benefit does not necessarily mean it's long-term benefit, because always, as it pertains to cellular metabolism, the slowly released glucose is the beneficial or preferred means of energy utilization by the neurons. Ketones give you a short-term boost, but long-term, it has significant effect as far as inflammation, oxidation, and long-term damage to the neurons. Where there is positive association, it's not with ketosis. It has to do with intermittent fasting and the part that reduces calorie intake. Low calorie has always been associated with longevity and brain health. And diets that are low in calorie actually turn on certain parts of the gene that creates longevity. So it doesn't have to do with the ketosis. It has to do with low calorie. And what's the best form of low calorie diet?
A whole food plant-based diet. Now let's talk about grains and gluten. It happens to be one of the most controversial aspects of plant-based eating. Now, there's a lot of evidence, and it's very strong, for a generous intake of dietary fiber over the lifespan, with whole grains representing a very important source of that fiber. Now, advocacy for including whole grains in the diet is widespread, but people are very concerned about the contribution of grains to obesity. In particular, concerns about rising prevalence of gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance, and concerns about genetic modification of wheat. But for the majority of people, gluten, which is a protein in wheat, is health promoting. There is a particular number of the population that have celiac disease, but they're rare. Only 1% of the population has celiac disease, and they have to stick to a gluten-free diet. About 1 in 1,000 may have wheat allergy, and about 1% of the population may have some sort of wheat sensitivity. There are some cases of people with irritable bowel syndrome, for example, that may improve on a gluten-free diet. So if you suffer from symptoms like chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain, and bloating, your doctors may want you to go gluten-free for a while and try to see if that is the case. But if you don't have any of those symptoms, gluten is actually good for you. The reason doctors and health professionals don't want to see people on gluten-free diets unless it's absolutely necessary is that for the 98% of people who don't have any gluten issues, whole grains, including gluten grains like wheat and barley and rye, are health promoting. They're actually associated with reduced coronary artery disease, reduced diabetes, stroke, cancer, obesity, and many other chronic diseases, including Alzheimer's. In fact, there was a study last year that suggested that a gluten-free diet was bad for our good gut bacteria. So we shouldn't go gluten-free unless there's a good medical reason for it. As far as the relationship between grain consumption and brain health is concerned, when you look at the longest living populations around the world, like the Okinawans or the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California, the Indians, who are mostly vegetarian and eat a grain-based diet, or the Sardinians in Italy, they all eat bread and grains, but not the type we find in our grocery aisles. They're usually 100% whole wheat, they're stone ground, and they're closest to its natural, unprocessed form. There are so many other population studies that have found that dietary grains appear strongly protective in relation to Alzheimer's disease. So don't fall for the grain-brain concept, and instead eat whole grains as part of a healthy diet. So let's talk about paleo diet. Now, the paleo or the Paleolithic diet is a variation of a low-carb diet. The particular focus in paleo diet is on emulating the dietary pattern of our Stone Age ancestors, with an emphasis on avoiding all kinds of processed foods, and the intake of vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds, in addition to eggs and lean meat. When we look at the Paleolithic periods, the estimates of our dietary patterns back then suggest that we are adapted to a high intake of plant foods, and the nutrients they contain include a high intake of dietary fiber, more than 100 grams, which is way higher than the typical level of less than 20 grams in the United States today.
And this data came from analysis of bones and feces of the people who lived back then.
Absolutely. One of the lesser challenges in reaching conclusions about the paleo diet is variations in our ancestral dietary patterns. And there's a lot of debate even right now as to what the salient features were. In a modern context, though, an even greater challenge tends to be the wide variability in how the rubric is interpreted and applied. And it's just impossible to replicate the diet of our Stone Age patterns with any real precision. Imagine how much people actually had to spend energy to find foods. And the vegetables and the fruit that we eat right now are not even close to how they were back then.
So the other thing they get wrong is the anthropology. So what was the average age back then? Around 30?
Yes.
Now, why would we apply ideas from the time where people lived an average of 30 to today where we want to live past 40, 50, 60? We want to live past 80 and 90. In fact, the whole point of what we're doing here in chronic diseases is to apply concepts that have been shown to be beneficial for those well into their 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. So that concept doesn't fit at all as well.
So bottom line is, it's always a good idea to eat an unprocessed diet. But when you hear the word paleo, remember that the interpretation is such that it means more meat and more fat and less complex carbohydrates that are derived from whole grains and plants. And there is no evidence that that type of dietary pattern is actually good for the brain.
Or the fact that it actually existed. So new fat is the lectins. This came out of a book that was written by a surgeon and who has never done a research, but it was an interesting concept because it actually confirmed people's biases. Certain plants are bad, so go back to your bacon and eggs and all these things. But the evidence is actually lacking. In fact, all the evidence in the book is contrary or weak. The main elements of the book say that plants that have lectins can actually be harmful for us. And this has not been strongly supported because what's the food that has the highest amount of lectins?
Beans.
And where in the world do you find people that live the longest and healthiest in those blue zones? At the cornerstone of their diet is beans. So this doesn't make sense. There is no correlation, neither from the blue zones or any other studies. And as it happens, whenever you're very smart, if you create the disease and then you also sell the solution for the disease. So with that lectins came lectin blocking pills. So there is no evidence that lectins or foods that contain lectins are harmful. And if you avoid those foods that contain lectins, you actually might miss out on amazing nutrients and vitamins that can only be acquired through those foods. And my favorite, coconut oil.
Oh, wow. Yes.
The power of a good story and a good anecdote. That whole revolution around coconut oil started around one person. One doctor who said that she cured her husband by giving him coconut oil.
And he supposedly had Alzheimer's disease.
And there's no evidence that that actually worked. But the idea that coconut oil can save you from Alzheimer's can be incredibly destructive. In fact, coconut oil is one of the few plant-based oils that has more than 90% saturated fats. Mm-hmm. So it can be actually harmful. So that's why data has not corroborated that anecdote. So that's where the danger of anecdotes are. The one-off, one story. The fact that we hear that my uncle smoked till he was 100 and he was fine. But the general population data shows that smoking kills. General population data on coconut oil has not demonstrated any benefits as it pertains to Alzheimer's, or for that matter, for any chronic diseases. So that's another fad that we would like to debunk.
In fact, a couple of weeks ago, a paper was published from Harvard University with Dr. Walter Willett, who is the chair of the nutrition department there, along with other authors who at some point didn't quite agree with the concept of saturated fat being bad for you. They came to a consensus, and the report states that saturated fat is associated with higher mortality. And they mentioned coconut oil specifically in that paper, saying that we have to hold off on making recommendations about coconut oil because there was no data that supported its benefit.
So I hope you enjoyed the fat section. See you in the next video.